Welcome to Key Tech. Please describe this channel if you are interested in today's video. Recently, Hanhai Group announced that it will inject 128.2 billion rubles, equivalent to 11 billion yuan, into its Indian subsidiary. All of this capital will be used to build new factories in India to expand Apple's iPhone production capacity in the country. As the largest company in the fruit chain, the iPhone manufactured by Hanhai Group already occupies 60% to 70% of the market share. Foxconn is a subsidiary of Hanhai Group. Hanhai Group's renewed focus on India this time also shows that Apple is determined to move production capacity away from China. Surveys show that about 13% of iPhones are produced in India this year, and this proportion will increase to 25% next year. Ironically, when Apple CEO Cook visited China not long ago, he hypocritically stated that Apple has a win-win relationship with the Chinese supply chain, claiming that 95% of Apple's production capacity is assembled and manufactured in China. However, Cook's real intention is to appease Chinese consumers who are worried about Apple's declining sales in the Chinese market. In fact, Apple is accelerating the transfer of production capacity to India and Vietnam. Today's Apple is very much like Samsung back then, determined to leave the Chinese market. Of course, since they don't want to stay, there is no need for us to force them to stay. If they eat the apple and then smash the pot, they will only be harmed in the end. About 20% of Apple's revenue comes from the Chinese market every year. Samsung's current situation has given Apple's possible future fate. For the domestic supply chain, it may only experience a period of pain, rather than a collapse due to the loss of Apple orders. Just like Ofilm back then, they did not follow Apple's advice to build a factory in India, but chose to stay in China. The chairman of Ofilm even said, "I am a Chinese company, and even if I die, I will die in China." In the past 3 years, Ofilm's life has been really difficult. Without orders from Apple, their revenue once plummeted by 90%. Loss every quarter. But with Huawei's counterattack this year, the Mate 60 series became an instant hit, and Ofilm also re-emerged following Huawei's supply chain. In the third quarter of this year, Ofilm achieved operating income of 4.5 billion yuan, a year-on-year increase of 48%, and net profit attributable to the parent company also reached 54.32 million yuan, declaring that the company has emerged from the cold winter. This once again proves that no one is inseparable from the other, and Apple's overconfidence will only bring trouble for itself. Hanhai Group once again injected 11 billion yuan into its Indian subsidiary. This is a very important move. It not only represents the strategic adjustment of Hanhai Group, but also highlights Apple's huge potential in the Indian market. As the second most populous country in the world, India has a huge consumer market and potential industrial base. Apple's choice to expand production capacity in India can, on the one hand, further meet local users' demand for iPhones, and on the other hand, reduce costs and improve its competitiveness. For Hanhai Group, this move will not only consolidate its position in Apple's supply chain, but also further open up the Indian market and gain more business opportunities. This is also a manifestation of Hanhai Group's active expansion of global production capacity layout in compliance with the trend of the times. Apple's attitude towards China's supply chain has sparked controversy. Apple CEO Cook made a series of speeches during his previous visit to China, claiming that Apple and the Chinese supply chain have a mutually beneficial relationship. He said that 95% of Apple's production capacity is assembled and manufactured in China, expressing its trust and reliance on China's supply chain. However, there has been some controversy over the veracity and credibility of these words. For example, Apple has strengthened cooperation with India and Vietnam in recent years and gradually transferred some of its production capacity to these countries. This also shows that Apple's supply chain layout is not entirely dependent on China. While Cook claims a win-win situation with China's supply chain, he secretly moves production capacity to other countries. This approach raises questions about his true intentions. After all, a company's decisions should be made in pursuit of its best interests, not just in response to short-term performance pressures. Such inconsistent statements are bound to have a certain negative impact on Apple's image in the Chinese market. Apple's arrogant strategy may cause it to lose the Chinese market. Apple's performance in the Chinese market in recent years has been controversial. Although the Chinese market has always been one of Apple's important sales channels, accounting for about 20% of its annual revenue, Apple's attitude in the face of competitive pressure in the Chinese market is questionable. During his visit to China this time, Cook publicly expressed his support for China's supply chain to appease Chinese consumers, but behind the scenes he stepped up efforts to transfer production capacity to other countries. This arrogant strategy may cost Apple the Chinese market. At the same time, the rise of local Chinese companies in the mobile phone industry has also created huge competitive pressure on Apple. The rise of brands such as Huawei and Xiaomi has given Chinese consumers more choices. Compared with Apple's expensive products, Chinese consumers are more inclined to buy local brands with higher cost performance. If Apple does not adjust its strategy in time, it may lose its competitiveness in the Chinese market. Domestic supply chain companies' choices and experiences in transferring Apple's production capacity. Faced with Apple's move to transfer production capacity to India, domestic supply chain companies are also facing pressure to make choices and adjustments. Past cases have proven that changes in global supply chains are inevitable. For example, Ofilm faced pressure from Apple to transfer production capacity, but they chose to stick to China instead of following Apple's advice and building a factory in India. Although Ofilm's revenue and profits have declined for a period of time, with the rise of domestic brands such as Huawei, Ofilm has regained its growth momentum through cooperation with Huawei. This example tells us that domestic supply chain companies should adhere to their own development strategies instead of blindly following Apple's footsteps. After all, Apple's decisions often only consider its own interests and may not necessarily be in line with the long-term interests of domestic companies. Therefore, supply chain companies should formulate development strategies suitable for themselves based on their actual conditions. They should not only actively expand the domestic market, but also strengthen cooperation with domestic brands to jointly resist the pressure of external competition. Apple's production capacity transfer initiatives in recent years are attracting widespread attention and discussion. Hunhai Group's decision to invest heavily in India, as well as Apple CEO Cook's inconsistent remarks on China's supply chain, have given us something to think about. Both Apple and domestic supply chain companies are facing changes in the external environment and pressure from competition. In this era of change, every company needs to assess the situation and formulate strategies suitable for its own development. Drawing on Ofilm's experience, we should stick to our long-term goals, actively expand the domestic market, and strengthen cooperation with domestic brands to cope with the fierce competition. Whether it is Apple or supply chain companies, only by truly integrating closely with market demand and continuously innovating and changing can they achieve long-term survival and development in the fierce market competition.